When the emergency responders finally reached her, the doctors on scene declared she had, at most, 4 minutes left to live. This was not a dramatic guess. It was a clinical assessment. Just 240 seconds separated Irene Flores from a quiet, undignified end on the cold concrete floor of a parking garage. The man who had once placed a ring on her finger, her former husband Levi, had used those very same hands to systematically extinguish her life. He had locked his fingers around her throat, applying a steady, crushing force until her vision blurred and the world faded to absolute black. He continued to squeeze long after she went limp, holding on until the tiny, delicate vessels in her eyes ruptured, staining the whites a terrifying shade of crimson. He pressed down until her heart gave a final, desperate flutter and then ceased to beat altogether. The paramedics who revived her kept calling her survival a miracle, using the word over and over again. But Irene knew a chilling truth that they could never comprehend. For women in her position, miracles do not exist. There is only the brutal, exhausting act of enduring, shadowed by the terrifying certainty that the men who hunt you will always, without fail, return to finish the job. What she was completely unaware of was that her near-death experience had just declared a war. And the man who was about to lead that war was a predator infinitely more calculating and dangerous than her husband could ever dream of being. This story is about the nature of true power, the only currency that can guarantee your safety. You need to stay with me to understand how she finally acquired it. This story carries a truth every woman needs to hear. You were never weak for staying. Predators like Levi spend years perfecting their manipulation. Your only job is to take that first step, one phone call, one signature, one moment of believing you deserve to be safe. That single act of courage can change everything. This is a story that illustrates a fundamental truth every woman who has ever felt trapped must learn. When the institutions you trust abandon you, genuine protection is not found in a stack of legal documents. It is found in raw, undeniable power. The story you are about to hear reveals a harsh lesson that an untold number of women have been forced to absorb in complete silence. The system is not broken. It is intentionally designed to let you fall. Those expensive pieces of paper, the restraining orders that are meant to be a shield, the police reports filed with officers who barely hide their boredom, the hollow promises of lawyers who charge by the hour. Not one of those things can truly stop a man who is convinced that you belong to him. He will look at those court orders not as a boundary, but as a personal challenge to be overcome. But that grim reality does not mean you are condemned to face your monster all by yourself. Sometimes, an entirely different kind of protection emerges from a place you never would have imagined, from a hidden world you did not even know was real. And sometimes, the only force capable of bringing down a relentless, vicious predator is an even larger, more cunning predator. If you have ever felt hopelessly cornered, if you have ever cried out for help only to have your story doubted, if you have ever been told to just leave him as if it were as simple as walking out the door, then this story is for you. Before we go any further, I want to create a connection with you. Please, take a moment to leave a comment and tell me what part of the world you are tuning in from. And if the battle Irene is fighting strikes a chord with you, I would be honored if you would subscribe to this channel, because the story I have for you tomorrow will absolutely steal your breath. Now, let us go back to that pivotal moment, the instant that completely redefined the rest of her existence. The hospital room was a sterile universe of blinding, unforgiving white. The very air she struggled to inhale was saturated with the taste of harsh cleaning agents and sharp medicinal antiseptic, a constant and unwelcome reminder of how narrowly she had escaped her own death. The only sound in the oppressive silence was the consistent rhythmic beep of the cardiac monitor next to her bed. That robotic pulse did not sound like life returning. It sounded like a relentless countdown timer, marking the seconds of a future she had been brutally robbed of. Each and every breath Irene managed to pull into her lungs sent a fresh surge of searing fire through her broken ribs, a cruel punishment for the simple crime of staying alive. Yet, all that physical agony was nothing more than a faint whisper compared to the immense, crushing weight of one devastating conclusion. In this war, she was completely and utterly on her own. She had done everything she was supposed to do. She had meticulously filed every police report. She had gone to court to secure the restraining order. She had spent money she did not have on a lawyer, and, only hours before Levi tried to kill her, she had finally signed the divorce papers. And absolutely none of it had made any difference at all. Not a single one of her efforts had stopped him from attempting to murder her in cold blood. Her beautiful, rich auburn hair, the same hair she took such pride in styling every morning for the regulars at her coffee shop, was now a tangled, matted ruin, stiff with dried blood against the stark white of the hospital pillowcase. Her kind green eyes, which typically held a warm and resilient sparkle, were now swollen completely shut, invisible behind a grotesque mask of dark purple and black bruising that covered half her face. And the delicate skin of her throat was a horrific roadmap of his violence. Dark, perfectly distinct bruises in the precise shape of his fingers, a silent testament to her last suffocating moments on the cold, unforgiving pavement. She was a living canvas of his uncontrolled rage, struggling for each breath, fighting to grasp the impossible fact that she had somehow survived. Deep inside the traumatized corners of her mind, a cold, familiar voice whispered a promise she had been running from for years. He is going to come back for you. He always comes back to finish what he started. But what Irene could not possibly comprehend was that the fundamental rules of her life had already been rewritten. Floating in and out of a heavy, drug-induced fog, she started to perceive fragments of conversations happening in the hallway just outside her room. The voices she was hearing were not the gentle, calming tones of doctors or the cheerful chatter of the nursing staff. These were deep, resonant voices. They spoke with a chilling, precise edge of absolute, non-negotiable authority. The entire 7th floor is now on complete lockdown. Nobody comes in or out unless I personally clear them. My last count was 200 of our personnel deployed strategically throughout the hospital. This entire building is now a fortress. Parrish is on the premises. Benjamin Parrish is here in person. That specific name, Benjamin Parrish, managed to create only a small spark of recognition within Irene's clouded consciousness. She had a distant, hazy memory of seeing his face on the front page of the city newspaper, usually printed next to powerful words like tycoon and untouchable. He was some kind of massively important businessman in the city, a man who moved in circles far beyond her own. To her, he was simply a regular customer who would visit her coffee shop. He was a quiet, almost unnervingly intense man who always sat in the exact same corner booth, concealed himself behind a newspaper, and emanated a peculiar stillness that felt simultaneously like a profound source of safety and a sign of immense danger. She had no way of knowing that for the past 8 months, this very man, Benjamin Parrish, had been methodically observing her. She had no idea that he had registered the almost imperceptible way she would flinch whenever the shop's front door banged shut unexpectedly. She did not know he had witnessed the slight, persistent tremor in her hands as she refilled coffee cups during the slow afternoon lull. He had committed to memory the way she would never, under any circumstances, allow herself to look at her own reflection in the large plate glass windows at the front of the shop. And she most certainly had no idea that at the precise moment Levi's hands had clamped around her throat, the entire massive and clandestine empire belonging to Benjamin Parrish had roared to life with a singular, white-hot, and unshakable objective. You are going to want to witness what takes place when a man with the power of a crime boss chooses to wage a private war for a quiet coffee shop owner to whom he has never spoken a single word. What he does in the next few hours is going to leave you speechless. At that very instant, just on the other side of the thin, sterile partition of her hospital room, a clandestine army had taken over St. Mary's Hospital. It was Ben's personal army. They had transformed the public building into a completely impenetrable stronghold. 200 highly trained men, every one of them armed and lethally competent, had emerged from the city's dark corners as if summoned from thin air. They were now in absolute control of every doorway and every emergency exit. They were monitoring the live feed from every single security camera. They were personally vetting every single doctor, every nurse, and every staff member who attempted to access the seventh floor. The violent, unpredictable hurricane of her husband's fury was over. But a much more disciplined and far more lethal storm was just beginning to build its power. Irene's life was now permanently entangled with the most powerful and the most feared man in the entire state. She was no longer just Irene Flores, the quiet, hard-working owner of a small, struggling coffee shop. Without her consent or knowledge, she had become the sole focus of a crime lord who had just wagered his entire organization on the simple fact of her survival. The truly staggering cost of her salvation, and the true identity of the man who had paid that price without a single second of hesitation, was about to completely demolish everything she thought she understood about feeling safe, about the nature of power, and about the profound darkness that can hide in the hearts of men. It was the overpowering chemical scent of antiseptic that finally dragged her back to a reality that felt more like a conscious nightmare than a second chance. Irene's fractured, aching mind slowly started to reconstruct the chain of events that had delivered her to this sterile white room. Just the previous evening, she had held a secret meeting with Mr. Harrison, a divorce lawyer who had been recommended to her by a compassionate, elderly customer. That appointment, held in his peaceful, book-filled office, had felt both utterly terrifying and unbelievably liberating. After 7 incredibly long years of steadily escalating abuse, after countless broken bones and even more broken promises, after all the emergency room visits she had lied about to cover for him, Irene had at last found the strength to sign the documents. She could still feel the heavy weight of the pen between her fingers, recalling how they trembled as she carefully wrote her name on the official divorce filing. She could still picture the expression in Mr. Harrison's eyes. It was a complex look, a blend of deep admiration and serious professional worry. She vividly remembered the feeling of walking out of his office building and thinking to herself, for the very first time in almost 10 years, that she might actually have a real chance to escape. That one fragile glimmer of hope managed to survive for exactly 43 minutes. By the time she got back to her car in the rapidly darkening concrete parking garage, Levi was already there, waiting for her. He was propped casually against her driver's side door, with his arms folded across his chest and an expression on his face that was perfectly, terrifyingly blank. That complete lack of emotion was always the most dangerous warning sign. His explosive rage, when it finally came, was like a sudden volcanic eruption. But the bone-chilling emptiness that always preceded it was somehow infinitely worse. It was the sign that he had already decided her fate. "I found the lawyer's business card," he stated, and his voice was so unnervingly calm that it made the hairs on her arms stand up. "The one you thought you could hide underneath the floor mat of your car? Did you really honestly think I would not check a place that obvious?" The blood in her veins turned to ice, and a sickening wave of dizziness washed over her. "Levi, please, I am begging you, do not do this." He leaned in close, his voice a venomous whisper that cut through the air. "Did you honestly believe," he hissed, interrupting whatever she was about to say, "that you could ever leave me? Did that sad little coffee shop give you a false sense of courage? Did you think it could ever shield you from me?" He paused, letting the poison of his words sink deep into her soul. "I own you, Irene. I have always owned you, and you will be mine until the very last bit of air leaves your body." The violence that came next was not a moment of lost control. It was not a sudden, explosive fit of rage. It was a cold, deliberate demonstration of power. Each movement was precise. Each impact was measured. He was delivering a lesson intended to shatter her will, to break her spirit, and to destroy her body. He was not simply hurting her, he was methodically dismantling her piece by piece, proving with every agonizing second that her life was not her own. He was showing her that her hopes, her future, and her very body belonged to him and him alone. The final thing she could recall was the horrifying, unbearable pressure closing in around her throat. She remembered her world shrinking, her vision tunneling down to one tiny, fading speck of light. She could hear the faint, far-off sound of sirens, a desperate wail echoing through the distant city streets. Now, awake in this stark, cold hospital room, a terrible truth settled over Irene with chilling certainty. Even if she lived, even if every broken bone mended and every ugly bruise disappeared, Levi would find her again. He would hunt her down. He would never, ever stop. The restraining order she had celebrated was nothing more than a piece of useless paper. The divorce papers she had filed were just words that offered no real protection. She now understood that the only thing in this world that could stop a monster like Levi was power. It had to be a raw, undeniable, and absolute power that he could never dream of challenging. But how could a woman like her, a woman who had absolutely nothing, ever hope to find that kind of strength? Keep listening, because the answer to that very question is about to step through the door of her hospital room. Two figures stood a silent, imposing vigil at her hospital bed. One was positioned on her left, the other on her right. The first was a woman, tall and impossibly elegant, her dark business suit tailored with a precision that suggested immense wealth. Her name was Carrara. Every single thing about her, from her perfectly sculpted fingernails to the cold, analytical gleam in her eyes, declared that she was far more than a simple assistant. The second figure was a man of enormous size, standing by the door as if he were carved from a single, massive piece of granite. His posture was rigid, his body perfectly still, but his eyes were in constant motion. They scanned the hallway with a focused discipline that could only have been forged by years in an elite military unit. Neither of them said a word to Irene. They did not try to soothe her or offer any words of comfort. They gave no reason for their silent guard duty. When the hospital staff came into the room for their routine checks, they moved with a frantic, nervous energy. Their eyes remained glued to the white-tiled floor, refusing to look up. They avoided any attempt at casual conversation. The nurses never asked Irene about her pain or how she was feeling. They just did their jobs with hands that trembled slightly, and then they fled the room like startled animals escaping a predator's territory. Even through the thick, throbbing fog of pain that clouded her mind, Irene began to understand that something was deeply wrong. The flowers across the room were not a cheerful, cheap bouquet brought by a well-meaning friend. These were exquisite snow-white lilies, arranged by a professional in a heavy crystal vase that likely cost more than her entire month's rent. And the two men standing guard just outside her door were not the tired, overweight security guards who usually worked the night shift. They stood as still as statues, their sharp eyes sweeping the empty corridor with a deadly, predatory focus. Their silent, unmoving presence was a clear and unspoken promise of immediate, brutal violence against anyone who might pose a threat. "You are awake, Miss Flores," Carrara finally said. Her voice was strangely calm, completely detached from the tense atmosphere in the room. "You are at St. Mary's Hospital. Your condition has been stabilized. I want you to know that you are now under our complete and total protection." Protection? The single word was a dry, painful rasp in Irene's raw throat. Just speaking felt like she was swallowing shards of broken glass. Protection from what? The police arrested him. They took Levi away, did they not? Carrara offered a small, almost imperceptible nod in response. "The authorities do have Mr. Donnelly in their custody at this time," she confirmed, her tone remaining flat, as if she were discussing the weather. "However, some dangers exist that our legal system is simply not designed to contain. The man who has provided for your security and your medical treatment does not trust in temporary solutions. He believes only in permanent ones." A deep, chilling dread, far colder than any physical pain, began to crawl down Irene's spine. Permanent solutions. The words echoed in the silent room, heavy with unspoken and terrifying meaning. What could she possibly mean by that? As Irene's mind raced, trying to figure out the identity of this mysterious, powerful benefactor, the entire energy of the room shifted in an instant. The door opened with a soft, nearly inaudible click. The giant guard who had been standing like a stone sentinel by the window straightened his posture, his body becoming even more tense and alert. Carrara, who had seemed to be the picture of calm authority, immediately stood taller. She turned to face the doorway with a profound deference, a kind of respect you would only offer to a king. A man walked into the room. He was tall, and the dark, perfectly tailored suit he wore did little to hide the hard, powerful muscles of the frame beneath it. He moved with the silent, fluid grace of a panther, a deadly predator that seemed completely out of place in this sterile environment, yet somehow he commanded every molecule of air within it. His hair was the color of a moonless midnight sky. His jaw was carved into a hard, unforgiving line, and his entire presence radiated a dangerous aura of competence that could only have been earned through a life of violence. But it was his eyes that captured all of her attention and held it hostage. They were a shocking, piercing shade of ice blue, and they locked onto Irene with an intensity so powerful that it felt like it was pulling the very breath from her lungs. Deep within those ice-blue eyes, Irene saw an impossible mixture of emotions. There was a cold, murderous fury doing battle with an overwhelming, profound tenderness. A sharp, strategic intelligence was at war with a desperate, all-consuming worry. And then, the recognition hit her with the force of a physical blow. She knew this man. It was him. It was Benjamin Parrish, the quiet, serious man who occasionally came into her little coffee shop to sit alone. She was here in this hospital bed, a broken and bruised example of how completely and totally the legal system had failed to protect her. But this is not going to be another story about failure. This is a story about how real power, the kind of power that exists far above the law, can step in to shield the helpless when every other defense has been shattered. And you will want to keep listening to see exactly how true, permanent justice is finally served. Benjamin began to move toward her bed. Every single step he took was filled with the slow, deliberate confidence of a king surveying his domain. It was as if the very floor tiles of the hospital, and every single person inside its walls, were his to command. Carrara and the massive guard seemed to shrink in his presence. They pressed themselves back against the wall, fading into the shadows of the room until they were nearly invisible. They understood their role now was to be silent, to be unseen, and to obey any command without a moment's hesitation. He stopped right beside her bed. His tall, imposing frame cast a long, dark shadow that fell across her small, broken body. Beneath his intense stare, she felt impossibly fragile and exposed. She was like a tiny, shattered bird with broken wings, lost in an endless sea of white hospital sheets, fighting for every single painful breath. He did not move to touch her. He did not need to. The sheer weight of his presence was a physical thing, a solid wall of absolute authority that now stood between her and every danger in the world. His gaze moved slowly, taking in the ugly purple and black bruises that marked her skin. His eyes rested for a long, heavy moment on the cruel, dark outline of fingerprints that circled her throat. For a single, fleeting heartbeat, the cold fury that had defined his expression seemed to melt away. It was replaced by something far more frightening. It was a look of deep and dangerous compassion. If you have ever felt utterly alone, completely abandoned by the world, and wondered what it would be like for someone with limitless power to make you their sole priority, then you need to pay close attention. Because for the first time in her entire life, Irene was about to learn exactly how that feels. Irene? His voice was not loud, but it was a low, deep rumble that seemed to soak up every other sound in the universe, leaving the room in a state of profound and total silence. He did not ask her the useless question of how she felt. He offered no empty words of comfort or hollow promises. Instead, he spoke a single simple sentence that was about to change the entire direction of her life forever. Your life of fear is over. I am giving you my solemn promise. You will never again have a single reason to feel afraid. This was not an attempt to soothe her. It was a statement of absolute truth. It was a new law of physics for her world, spoken into existence by the sheer force of will belonging to Benjamin Parrish. The entire reality Irene had been forced to endure, a grim existence defined by terror, agony, and absolute helplessness, had been permanently erased from existence. It did not matter if she was ready for the change, because her universe had just been fundamentally and completely rewritten by the man who now stood over her. He carefully lowered his immense frame into the ridiculously small and fragile plastic chair beside her hospital bed, his sharp, penetrating gaze never leaving her face for even a second. The protective feeling that had been quietly building inside him for so many months had now erupted into a focused and deadly resolve. Every ounce of the incredible power he wielded, the kind of authority that could make the most violent criminals tremble at the mere mention of his name, now felt like a cheap and useless toy as he surveyed the brutal evidence of her suffering. He took in the ugly, discolored bruises that marred her skin. He pictured the shattered ribs hidden beneath the thin hospital sheets. He meticulously studied the violent, hand-shaped marks on her throat, and a rage so profound and total filled him that it felt like perfect, chilling calm. Benjamin Parrish was not a creature of habit. His entire life was a perfectly controlled whirlwind of violence, high-stakes risk, and constant strategic moves. But Irene, the quiet, gentle woman from the coffee shop, had somehow become his one and only unexplainable deviation from the plan. His visits to Flora's Coffee were never part of his official schedule. Those trips were raw impulses, sudden needs to escape when the crushing pressure of his dark and violent world became too much to bear. He never once went to that coffee shop because he wanted coffee. He went there for one reason and one reason alone: to simply watch her exist. He would consistently select the exact same booth tucked away in the farthest corner, a place deep in the shadows where he could make his formidable presence disappear behind the rustling pages of a newspaper and a simple steaming cup of black coffee. From this hidden observation post, he had carefully etched into his memory every one of her countless small kindnesses, the generous splash of extra cream she would pour for a homeless man shivering from the cold, the limitless patience she showed to a tourist who was hopelessly lost and confused, and the quiet, humble dignity in the simple motion of brushing a stray piece of auburn hair from her forehead before she turned to face a mountain of dirty dishes in the sink. He memorized the way her smile could light up her entire face when a customer was kind in return. He was certain that to any normal person looking in, she would seem delicate, a person who could be easily shattered by the cruelty of the world. Benjamin, however, perceived something completely different. He saw the sharp, efficient, and practiced movements of someone who was a true survivor, down to her very bones. He recognized the quiet, unbreakable strength of a woman who had obviously endured far more pain than any person should ever have to face. His piercing blue eyes had been expertly conditioned over a lifetime to identify three things with perfect accuracy: immediate danger, skillfully crafted lies, and cleverly hidden weaknesses. Over the course of many weeks of silent watching, he began to recognize the almost invisible signs of her hidden nightmare. The tiny, nearly undetectable tremor in her hands when she believed no one was watching her, the way she would physically recoil at any sharp or unexpected noise, the subconscious way she would fold in on herself, making herself smaller whenever a male customer spoke with a raised voice. He watched, and he mentally recorded how her normally gentle green eyes would sometimes flash as hard and cold as polished steel for just a heartbeat, a deeply rooted survival instinct that told him everything he needed to know about the private war she was forced to go home to every single night. In his eyes, she was a living symbol of innocence in a world that had long ago forgotten the meaning of the word. She was the physical form of quiet hope. She stood for a basic, fundamental human goodness that his brutal, violent life had conditioned him to either take advantage of or destroy without a second thought. And yet, defying all logic and going against every one of his survival instincts, she had somehow managed to become the only pure and untainted thing in his dark world. She was the single person for whom he would gladly sacrifice his entire criminal empire just to guarantee her safety. Months before, he had ordered his people to conduct a routine background investigation on her ex-husband, a man by the name of Levi Donnelly. The file that landed on his desk was almost insulting in its normalcy. It described a mid-level insurance agent with a spotless criminal history, no major debts, and zero connections to any of Benjamin's competitors or enemies. Benjamin had taken one look at the file and written the man off as an insignificant pest, a weak individual who was all talk. That one, thoughtless decision would turn out to be the most devastating mistake of his entire life. He had completely failed to understand a vital truth that he, of all people, should have known instinctively. The most lethal predators are not the ones who show their teeth in dark alleyways or fight for territory. The real monsters are the ones who wear expensive business suits, the ones who conceal their horrific violence behind the perfect green lawns and clean white fences of quiet suburban neighborhoods. This failure, this catastrophic misjudgment, was an error that Benjamin now fully intended to fix with a terrifying and permanent finality. The telephone call that changed his entire world arrived at precisely 14 minutes past midnight. Benjamin was located in his penthouse suite, a towering fortress of glass and steel at the very top of the city's highest skyscraper, from which he looked down upon a sprawling metropolis that was, in every practical sense, his own personal kingdom. He was deeply involved in analyzing the complicated logistics of an incoming illegal shipment worth tens of millions of dollars when his secondary, completely secure phone let out a single, sharp chirp. It was a sound he had designated for only the most severe and time-sensitive emergencies. The voice that spoke on the other end belonged to one of his informants, a man he had placed deep within the city's emergency dispatch system. The man's summary was delivered in a cold, professional monotone that somehow made the horrible words sound even worse. A female assault victim had been discovered, the result of what was being called extreme domestic violence. Her name was Irene Flores. Her condition was officially listed as critical. The initial report from the emergency medical team detailed blunt force trauma to her head and chest, probable massive internal bleeding, and a partially collapsed windpipe. They estimated that when they found her, she had been less than 4 minutes away from death. The report ended with the information that the person responsible, her ex-husband Levi Donnelly, was already in the custody of the police. The news did not just break Ben. It vaporized a lifetime of carefully constructed control. The composure he wore like armor did not crack or shatter. It simply ceased to exist, replaced by a vast, cold silence in his soul. In that profound emptiness, a single, horrifyingly clear thought began to grow. It was a cold and deliberate fury that illuminated the only path forward. An official arrest would be a pathetic performance, a meaningless piece of theater for the public. The system he once respected was nothing but a corrupt stage, designed to create the illusion of safety while justice remained a fantasy. Levi might get a few years in a cage, a mere interruption to his life of cruelty. He would emerge, not changed, but sharpened by resentment. He would walk out older, angrier, and fiercely determined to finish the monstrous act he had started. Ben would not allow that future to happen. He understood that true power is not for acquiring wealth, but for shielding the innocent, and he was about to give a master class on the subject. Stay close, because you need to see what a man does when the system completely fails him. Ben did not raise his voice. He did not move a single muscle in his chair. With a calm, measured motion, he lifted his secure phone. He dialed one number from memory, connecting to Marcus, the most capable and feared man in his entire organization. Ben uttered only 2 words, his voice a low whisper that carried the weight of an executioner's sentence. It is time. The command was spoken so softly, yet it was so absolute, that on the other end of the line, Marcus, a man who had faced down death without flinching, instinctively took a step backward. "I need every operational asset online immediately," Ben commanded, his tone flat and dangerously calm. "I want 200 of our best people forming a perimeter around St. Mary's Hospital. You have less than 1 hour to make it happen. I am authorizing a full tactical lockdown of the facility. No one enters that building, and no one leaves, without my direct authorization." "And Marcus," Ben added, a new layer of ice in his voice, "start digging. I want every secret Levi Donnelly has ever buried. I want his life, his finances, his entire world taken apart piece by piece and delivered to me before sunrise." The events that transpired over the next few hours would become a chilling, legendary display of Benjamin Parrish's real power and reach. You need to pay attention, because he was about to bring down a storm on this city that no one had ever seen before. The response to his orders was not merely quick, it was instantaneous, brutally efficient, and stunning in its perfect coordination. In just a matter of minutes, the entire complex machinery of the parish organization shifted its purpose. This was a sprawling, clandestine empire, a superpower hidden in plain sight that dominated global shipping lanes, held a complete monopoly on the region's construction industry, and ruled the city's criminal underworld with absolute authority. Now the full, crushing weight of that entire empire was being redirected. Its new and only mission was to protect a single broken woman fighting for her life in a hospital room. The mobilization that Marcus set into motion was a masterpiece of logistics, rolling out in 3 distinct and perfectly synchronized waves. The operation started with the eyes, the first layer of a complex and invisible net. 40 men, driving unmarked black cars, seemed to melt out of the city's alleyways and side streets. They moved without haste, sliding into pre-planned positions that gave them total visual control of the hospital and its surroundings. One operative settled into the lobby, his face hidden behind a newspaper. Another took up a watch post from inside a vehicle on the 3rd level of the parking garage. A small team occupied a corner booth in the cafe across the street, while spotters secured vantage points from the roofs of adjacent buildings. These were not common thugs. They were elite specialists, experts in surveillance, and the subtle art of psychological control. With silent, practiced skill, they breached the hospital's digital infrastructure, hijacking the entire security camera system. On their monitors, they started a quiet ballet of misdirection, digitally rerouting nurses' paths and guiding orderlies away from key areas. They were building a virtual fortress around the entire 7th floor, isolating it completely from the rest of the hospital. The second wave was the infiltration team, 60 operatives, clad in perfect disguises and equipped with impeccable forged identification, arrived in a mix of emergency and service vehicles. They appeared as paramedics transporting a patient, as auditors checking security systems, and as technicians performing maintenance on critical equipment. This cover allowed them to move unseen through the hospital's arteries, securing every service corridor, utility tunnel, and maintenance shaft. They seized control of the service elevators, giving them the power to dictate all movement between floors. Systematically, every real security guard, every overnight administrator, and every janitor was quietly taken out of play. Some were presented with cash bribes so large they could not be refused. Others were politely, but firmly, informed their shift was over. The few who resisted found that their key cards had mysteriously stopped functioning. Just as the first hint of gray appeared in the eastern sky, the third and final wave made its entrance, and it was a raw declaration of absolute dominance. 100 men, the elite core of Ben's personal security force, flooded into the hospital. They methodically took up positions at every entrance, every exit, every elevator bank, and every stairwell on every single floor. They were dressed in perfectly tailored dark suits, and they moved with a lethal grace that was far more terrifying than any visible weapon. Their silent, disciplined presence alone transformed the building's atmosphere from a place of healing into a fortress under the command of an unquestionable power. Dr. Patricia Henley, the night shift supervisor, was a woman forged in the crucible of 15 years in a high-traffic urban emergency room. For the first time in more than a decade, she felt a cold, hard knot of genuine fear form in her gut. She had orchestrated the response to catastrophic highway pileups. She had stitched up the victims of brutal gang warfare. She had even worked through a federal raid on a rival hospital. But this was something else entirely. This was not the familiar noise of chaos. This was a silent, flawless invasion carried out by men who were too calm, too organized, and radiated an aura of authority she had never before witnessed. A man who only gave his name as the commander approached her directly. His tranquil expression somehow made him even more intimidating. He presented her with a set of credentials that appeared so official, so flawlessly authentic, that it made her blood run cold. "Doctor, we are here to prevent a private matter from escalating any further," he stated, his voice calm and completely devoid of any emotion. "We will ensure the absolute safety and security of your staff and every one of your patients. However, Room 712 is now under federal jurisdiction. It is under our complete and total control." His words were spoken with politeness, but they carried the undeniable finality of a decree. Dr. Henley heard her own voice agreeing to all of his terms, her primal need for survival overriding the part of her mind that was screaming that this was wrong. In what seemed like only a few moments, but was in fact less than 60 minutes, St. Mary's Hospital was no longer a public institution. It had been expertly and systematically transformed into a private, impenetrable fortress under Ben's command. From the silent, armored interior of his sedan, Ben watched the sun begin to rise. He glided through streets that were now, for all intents and purposes, his sovereign territory. The sky above was a violent and spectacular explosion of brilliant gold and deep crimson. The breathtaking beauty of the dawn felt like a personal insult, a gorgeous painting that had no right to exist in the middle of his ugly reality. Every single dollar of his vast, almost unimaginable fortune, and every bit of his far-reaching influence, now felt like nothing more than worthless ash in his mouth. None of it meant anything when he compared it to the image burned into his mind, the dark, ugly purple of the bruises that were blooming on Irene's neck. As his car drove through the city he owned, Ben was forced to confront an emotion he had long ago banished from his life: absolute, crushing helplessness. He had failed to keep her safe. He could see it with painful clarity now. He had been too careful, too slow, obsessed with trying to find a normal, gentle way to become a part of her world. He had been waiting for the perfect moment, the perfect, gentle invitation. And because of that foolish, romantic delay, Levi had come brutally close to extinguishing the only light, the only source of genuine goodness, in his dark and violent existence. That colossal failure officially ended right now. He stepped out of the vehicle, and the heavy door closed behind him with a sound of utter finality. He walked through the hospital lobby, a space that was now his own. As he passed, each of his soldiers stiffened their spines, their bodies snapping to a state of rigid, disciplined attention. He moved between them with the heavy, deliberate walk of a king moving through his court. But the invisible crown of power that he always wore now felt cold, heavy, and deeply tarnished by his unforgivable mistake. The elevator ride to the 7th floor felt as though it stretched on for an entire lifetime. With each floor the car ascended, the glowing number on the display felt like another torturous step toward facing the hurricane of raw, violent emotion he was desperately fighting to control. He finally reached her floor and stepped out into the hallway, pausing for a moment before the door to room 712. He drew a single, deep, ragged breath, forcing himself to construct a wall of ice around the inferno raging inside him. He was a man who knew destruction on an intimate level. He had built his entire empire on his mastery of it. But he knew that witnessing her destruction would be a completely different kind of agony. He pushed the door open without a sound and walked toward her bed. His large, powerful frame cast a long, protective shadow over her small, broken body, as if trying to shield her from the very memory of what had happened. Seeing her lying there, the brilliant red of her hair tangled and matted with dried blood, her face swollen and painted with the dark colors of his failure, the distinct, finger-shaped bruises that circled her throat, it unleashed a silent, white-hot cataclysm of fury inside of him. It was a rage so absolute, so profound, that it threatened to obliterate the iron self-control he had spent decades perfecting. Irene, he said. Her name was a raw, possessive claim in the sterile quiet of the room. You are safe now. I am here. I give you my word, you will never ever have to be afraid again. After making his unbreakable vow, he settled his large body into the uncomfortable and unforgiving plastic chair that sat beside her bed. In that single moment, he underwent a complete transformation, no longer an architect of a criminal empire, but now her steadfast, silent protector. Just beyond the door to her room, and positioned with strategic precision all throughout the hospital, his Benjamin Parrish occupied the stark, unforgiving chair pulled close to her hospital bed. Sleep was a distant country he had no plans to visit. He was completely, alertly awake. His intense blue eyes were wide open, staring into the middle distance of the sterilized room, waiting patiently for her to surface from the depths of unconsciousness. The jacket of his perfectly cut suit hung open, revealing the hard, powerful lines of the body beneath the expensive fabric. Not a single strand of his dark hair was out of place, and his entire being projected an aura of profound, unshakable self-assurance. It was the kind of confidence that did not simply expect the world to bend to his will, but assumed it already had. The words he had spoken to her earlier drifted back through the painful haze in her mind. You are safe now. You will never live in fear again. That promise should have been a lifeline, a comfort to her shattered nerves. Instead, it triggered a new surge of fear, one that was colder and more piercing than anything she had felt before. Throughout her entire life, she had come to understand that real safety was a quiet, unassuming thing. Safety had never before come with the overwhelming presence of what felt like a private, heavily armed military force occupying an entire hospital wing. She tried to shift, to push herself into a sitting position to better understand her cage, but the bruised and broken ribs along her side erupted in a scream of pure, electric fire. The sudden movement ripped an involuntary, sharp gasp of pain from her throat. In less than a heartbeat, Ben's head snapped in her direction. The speed of his transition, from absolute marble-like stillness to a state of razor-sharp predatory focus, was a thing of terrifying, inhuman speed. It was more unsettling than any normal human reaction she had ever seen. "Do not even think about moving," he commanded her. His voice was a low, resonant rumble, yet it was layered with an absolute authority that tolerated no discussion and expected immediate obedience. With the liquid, controlled grace of a panther rising to its feet, he stood from the small chair. He reached out, placing a firm but surprisingly gentle hand on her upper arm, his touch impossibly careful as he took great pains to avoid the map of bruises and injuries that decorated her skin. The physician's instructions were exceptionally clear, he went on, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. You are suffering from severely torn muscle tissue and extensive internal bruising. Your one and only responsibility right now is to remain still and allow your body to heal. This is not a suggestion, it is a mandate. Irene's battered mind struggled to grasp the clinical words. Her throat felt impossibly constricted, a phantom sensation that was the physical memory of Levi's hands tightening around her neck, squeezing the life from her. But the immense, quiet way this man simply consumed all the oxygen in the room created a completely different kind of pressure. It was a weight that had nothing to do with physical assault, but felt just as suffocating. Who are you? The question finally broke free, a ragged, desperate whisper that had to fight its way past the knot of terror lodged deep in her throat. For a long, unnerving moment, he was perfectly still, his gaze fixed on her. Then, he finally provided an answer. "My name is Ben. I was a regular customer who visited your coffee shop." His voice was perfectly calm and the answer was deceptively simple, yet it managed to explain absolutely nothing at all. "No." The word was barely a sound, but somewhere inside the shattered ruins of her body, she discovered a small, flickering ember of defiance. "That is not the question I am asking. I can hear the staff whispering about you in the hallway. I can see the way the nurses and the doctors navigate this room, how they move as if they are tiptoeing across a floor covered in broken glass. This place does not feel like a hospital anymore. It feels like a heavily fortified military compound." The man I knew from the coffee shop was a quiet man. He was the customer who always ordered black coffee and read his newspapers in peace. That man, the quiet one, does not have an army of 200 guards at his command. Ben did not insult her intelligence by offering a denial or attempting to spin a lie. He simply moved with deliberate grace over to the large window. With slow, precise movements, he adjusted the angle of the blinds, carefully softening the harsh morning sunlight that was falling across her bruised and swollen face. Only after he had shielded her did he turn back to face her fully. "My full name is Benjamin Parrish," he said, his voice completely level and devoid of emotion. "I am the individual responsible for saving your life. I am also the individual who directs a very large portion of the unspoken, unofficial commerce that takes place within this state's borders. The police department maintains a rather thick file on me. In their reports, they have labeled me a crime boss. The men and women who are in my employ refer to me as the chairman. And you, Irene, you have only ever known me as your quietest, most dependable customer." The unfiltered truth of his statement did not just shock her. It slammed into her like a physical force, violently stealing the air from her lungs and leaving her utterly breathless. Benjamin Parrish. It was a name known by every single person who lived and breathed in the city. There was no one who had not heard it. His name was a synonym for absolute, unquestionable, and untouchable power. It was a name that was always whispered in connection with vast, invisible fortunes and terrifying rumors of brutal violence that never, ever found its way into the official news. He was meant to be a myth, a ghost story that parents might tell their misbehaving children, not a flesh-and-blood man who sat quietly in her coffee shop and ordered a simple black coffee every morning. The delicate, fragile sense of security that she had just begun to allow herself to feel only a few moments before instantly curdled into a thick, suffocating wave of pure horror. Now she understood with perfect, chilling clarity. She had not been rescued from the clutches of a monster. She had merely been taken by a different and infinitely more powerful monster. "You are the head of the Mafia," she managed to breathe, the words coming out as a choked, barely audible sound. "I am a man who commands significant resources," Ben corrected her, his tone remaining surprisingly gentle, almost instructive. "I have at my disposal a level of resources that a pathetic creature like Levi Donnelly could never even begin to comprehend. And it is critical that you understand this, Irene. He was within 4 minutes of successfully ending your life. This security detail you see around you is not for dramatic effect. It is an absolute, non-negotiable necessity. Levi may be an insignificant man, but he has friends within his disgusting little world. More importantly, he operates under the twisted, diseased conviction that he owns you. He is not going to stop trying to get to you. But I give you my word, neither will I." Irene's mind scrambled, desperately trying to merge the two completely incompatible images of the man before her. There was the quiet, kind stranger who on rare occasions would offer her a small, almost shy smile from behind his newspaper. And then there was the undisputed king of the city's entire criminal empire, who now stood like a sentinel, watching over her in a hospital bed. Why? The question ripped itself from her throat, raw and trembling with desperate, painful confusion. Why would you do any of this for someone like me? We are strangers. I am a nobody. I am nothing more than a woman who owns a tiny coffee shop. A woman who is just trying to finally break free from a terrible, violent marriage. Ben walked back towards the uncomfortable plastic chair, but he did not sit down again. Instead, in a gesture that completely and utterly stunned her, he slowly, deliberately knelt down on the cold, sterile linoleum floor. It was a calculated movement that brought his piercing blue eyes to the exact same level as hers. The action should have diminished him, made him seem smaller and less intimidating. Somehow, it achieved the exact opposite. It made his focus on her feel more concentrated, more complete, more terrifyingly absolute. It began several months ago, simply by watching you, he confessed, and his voice dropped to a low, intimate register she had never heard before. In the world I inhabit, you were an anomaly, something that did not belong. I saw you work from before the sun rose until long after it had set. I witnessed the incredible grace you managed to hold on to. Even when you were so exhausted you were practically swaying on your feet. Then I started to see the smaller details. The almost imperceptible way you would flinch if a customer raised their voice too suddenly. The careful way you always angled your body to avoid catching your own reflection in the front window. A muscle in his powerful jaw clenched, a small but visible sign of his deep frustration with himself. I knew you were living in some kind of pain, so I had my people conduct background inquiries on Levi. They were surface-level checks at first, nothing intrusive. The initial reports that came back were clean. They painted a picture of a pathetic but ultimately harmless man. That was my failure. It was my unforgivable, arrogant mistake. I judged him based on the public mask he wore when I should have been digging deeper into the darkness he was hiding from the world. I wanted to approach you in a normal way, without the suffocating weight of my reputation standing between us. I was waiting, like a fool, for what I thought would be the perfect moment. His hand came to rest on the stiff white sheet near her arm, and his knuckles turned bone white from the sheer force of his grip. And then, because of my hesitation, he put you in this hospital bed. When my people finally reached me from the emergency room and relayed the full extent of your injuries, when they told me you were 4 minutes away from death, I finally understood the depth of my error. My patience was not a virtue, it was a selfish vanity, and that vanity almost cost me the only genuinely valuable thing I have found in many, many years. In that instant, your safety stopped being a priority. It became an absolute. This entire operation, all of these men, this fortress you see around you, this is what happens when I finally accept that I am not permitted to fail you ever again. Irene was caught in a violent storm of emotions. First, there was the searing pain of betrayal, the sharp realization that the gentle man who had saved her life was, in fact, the very monster everyone in the city whispered about with fear. That shock was followed by a chilling dread, the cold weight of knowing she was now indebted to Benjamin Parrish, the most formidable and dangerous man in the entire state. Yet buried beneath all that terror and confusion, another feeling rose to the surface, one so unexpected it stole her breath, a profound and overwhelming sense of relief. She was utterly petrified of this man, but for the first time in over a decade of relentless anxiety, she felt completely, fundamentally safe. If you have ever experienced that specific moment, that unbelievable release when years of crushing fear are suddenly erased because a far greater power has stepped between you and your personal demon, then you understand the revolution happening in Irene's heart. Keep listening, because what happens next is a lesson in what true, uncompromising protection really means. "What about Levi?" she finally asked, her voice a fragile thing that trembled in the quiet room. "What's going to happen to him now?" In a fraction of a second, the comforting warmth in Ben's eyes vanished completely. It was replaced by a look of cold, impenetrable steel. The predator she had sensed coiled beneath his calm surface was now fully awake, and his silent, lethal energy seemed to press in from all sides, making the air thick and heavy. "The police have taken him into custody," he said, his voice level and devoid of emotion. "But the official justice system is an imperfect machine. It has significant limitations. It operates on a narrow set of charges and follows rigid sentencing rules. It attempts to quantify justice in terms of years spent in a cage. He then pushed himself up from the chair, his considerable height and broad shoulders, making the spacious hospital room feel suddenly small and confining. My system operates differently. It is not concerned with time, it deals only in consequences. Those consequences are absolute. They are delivered immediately, and they are irreversible. He will never get near you again, Irene. He will never know a single moment of freedom for the rest of his life. The man who tried to end your existence has just learned a very hard lesson. The security that the law was unable to give you, I have now provided. He has learned that making an enemy of me is a mistake from which there is no recovery. The terrifying implication of his statement hung in the atmosphere like a dense fog. Levi was not going to be tried in a court of law. He was about to face the Mafia's version of justice, a final judgment passed down with a finality no legal proceeding could ever hope to achieve. Irene's eyes moved past Ben's imposing frame to the window, looking out at the city where an unseen force of men now stood as her guardians. She felt like a small, delicate bird that had been placed inside a magnificent but inescapable cage. A cage forged by a crime lord who had just claimed total ownership of her life and her safety. She was horrified by the brutal truth of what he was. Yet she could not deny the simple, powerful fact. When the law and everyone else had completely failed her, he had arrived with both the limitless power and the resolute will to keep her safe. "I feel like I don't know who you are anymore," she admitted, her words so quiet they were almost lost in the air. "Are you the kind man who pulled me from that dark alley, or are you the ruthless crime boss who holds this entire city in his hand?" "I am both of those men," Ben replied with stark honesty. "But where you are concerned, Irene, I am only one thing: the man who will ensure your safety, regardless of the cost. For right now, that is all you need to know." He slowly extended his hand toward her, his every movement measured and deliberate, giving her more than enough time to flinch away if she felt the need. His fingertips made contact with the unmarred skin along her jawline. The touch was warm and deeply possessive, yet it held no romance. It was a silent, unambiguous declaration of his claim, not over her, but over her well-being. "You need to rest now and heal," he said, his voice softening. "Once you have recovered your strength, we will talk about what comes next. I can promise you that your future is now something that is completely and permanently secure." He withdrew his hand and moved back to his chair on the other side of the room, resuming his position as her silent, watchful sentinel. This part of their story, however, was not over. At that exact same time, just on the other side of her door in the sterile hospital corridor, a situation was developing that would change the course of everything. Carrara entered the room without a sound, her face a pale, taut mask of carefully managed alarm. She walked straight to Ben's position, bent down, and spoke urgently into his ear. Whatever information she delivered caused his entire body to go rigid, every muscle locking into a state of absolute stillness. "Tell me that again," he ordered, his voice so low it was more menacing than any shout could ever be. "A surveillance unit intercepted a phone communication," Carrara repeated, keeping her own voice hushed. "Levi Donnelly made a call from inside the police station. He made contact with an individual named Frank Mercer. They shared a cell in prison, and Mercer was released 6 months ago. The man has an extensive history as a violent contractor." She paused, taking a steadying breath. The call was brief. Levi offered him $50,000 to complete the task he failed to do. "He wants you dead tonight." Irene felt a shock of pure ice course through her veins. Even behind bars, even with an army of 200 men guarding her, Levi was still actively orchestrating her murder. Some of you who are hearing this tale know this feeling with an awful intimacy. It is that moment of pure, soul-shattering despair when you realize that your tormentor will never stop. They will never give up, no matter what barriers you put in their way, and no matter how far you run. Irene was living through that exact nightmare right now. What she could not yet grasp, however, was that she was finally protected by a man who possessed the absolute power to make him stop, permanently. Ben displayed no outward sign of alarm. His cold, controlled expression did not change, but the very air around him seemed to thicken and crackle, charged with a wave of lethal purpose so intense that it made Carrara instinctively take a half-step back from him. "What is Mercer's current position?" Ben asked, his voice a low, steady rumble. "Our team has him under surveillance at a motel on 5th Street. It appears he is preparing to depart." Ben got to his feet with a slow, deliberate grace, his movements methodical as he straightened and buttoned his suit jacket. When he spoke again, his voice was deceptively calm, almost conversational. The words he chose, however, were infused with the unmistakable weight of a death sentence. "I want him intercepted before he takes a single step out of that motel parking lot. I want him to understand, in the final moments he has on this earth, precisely whose wrath he has invited tonight." "And Carrara?" "Yes, Chairman," she answered, her tone now strictly formal. "I want you to arrange for Levi Donnelly to be informed of what happens next. I want him to comprehend that every single person he attempts to hire, every pathetic plan he concocts, every single breath he takes from this moment on is a gift that I am choosing to allow him. And I want him to know, with absolute certainty, that I can revoke that gift whenever I please." He then shifted his focus back to Irene, and for a brief, stunning moment, the mask of cold fury seemed to dissolve. What replaced it was an expression of surprising tenderness. "You are going to be safe," he promised her again, his voice now gentle. "I am going to personally guarantee it. When I return to this room, the threat against you will be permanently removed from this world." He turned and strode from the room, leaving Irene in the care of two stone-faced guards and the overwhelming, thunderous knowledge that this man would stop at nothing, absolutely nothing, to honor his word to her. This is the reality of true protection when it is supported by genuine, absolute power. Stay with me, because the next few hours of this narrative will show you exactly how far Benjamin Parrish was willing to go. Frank Mercer never made it out of that motel parking lot. The precise details of what transpired there were never made public, but the message that was broadcast that night was received with perfect clarity. By sunrise the next day, every hired thug, every corrupt official, and every criminal element in the city knew the new and unbreakable law. Irene Flores was to be considered completely and totally untouchable. To cause her harm, to speak a threat against her, or to even entertain a negative thought in her direction, was to sign your own death warrant, one that came with no trial and no chance of appeal. At the same time, Levi Donnelly, shivering in his cold jail cell, had an unscheduled visitor. It was one of Ben's men carrying the identification of a public defender. "Your friend Mercer is not coming," the man stated in a pleasant, conversational voice. "Actually, nobody is ever coming for you again. You have made a catastrophic miscalculation, Mr. Donnelly. You assumed the steel bars of this facility would protect you. They will not. There is no corner of this world where you can hide from what you have set in motion. Every morning you wake up for the rest of your life will be because Mr. Parrish has decided to permit it. I suggest you use that time for some quiet and profound reflection." The man gave him a polite, almost friendly smile, then slid a single photograph across the metal table. The image was of Frank Mercer's now vacant motel room. On the neatly made bed, someone had placed a single, perfect white lily. Without another word, he stood up and walked away. Levi Donnelly never attempted to contact another soul about Irene. But Ben's retribution was far from over. He was only just beginning. When he returned to the hospital, he walked into Irene's room with a satellite phone pressed to his ear. The fragments of the conversation she overheard next began to reveal the truly staggering scope of the revenge he was about to unleash. "Marcus," Ben said quietly into his phone, his voice calm but lethal. "I need you to arrange for an immediate, anonymous, full-spectrum financial audit to be launched against Levi's insurance company. I want a specific and merciless focus on Donnelly's personal expense accounts, and I want it to go back for the last 5 years. The objective here is to strip him of every single asset and affiliation that gives him his perceived status and power. His entire professional identity is to be systematically dismantled, and it is to begin today. He paused for a moment, listening to the response from the other end of the line before he continued giving his instructions. Have you received confirmation that our associate in the district attorney's office is fully prepared to move forward? That is excellent news. I want you to ensure that the charges filed against him are the most severe felony charges allowed by law. I want his documented history of violating every previous restraining order to be the headline in every single news report. We are, in effect, providing the police with a perfectly legal and unbreakable rope with which to hang him, and at the same time, we are feeding the media a story that will permanently and irrevocably destroy his public reputation. Irene could only lie there and listen, trapped somewhere between a state of profound awe and a deep, chilling sense of fear. Ben was not just neutralizing a physical threat. He was systematically, and with the precision of a surgeon, erasing Levi Donnelly from the world, piece by piece, relationship by relationship, and dollar by dollar. The moment Ben disconnected the call with Marcus, his phone buzzed to life again with a new caller. Irene watched a storm gather across his features, his expression turning harder and more severe with every word he heard from the other end of the line. "Give me the details from the expanded file," he ordered, his voice clipped and devoid of warmth. "I want you to focus specifically on his history with women. What did our deep background investigation turn up?" As he listened, his face transformed into a mask of pure, cold rage. "His fiancée in Chicago, the one from 2018, he stated, his tone dropping to a dangerous whisper. An anonymous tip was called into the police department, detailing extensive property damage and an injury that was ruled an accident. I need to know why that case was never pursued." He paused, absorbing the information. "Now, tell me about the wife he had before Irene." "There was a swift divorce, a settlement that was unusually large, and it was sealed with a non-disclosure agreement. Your priority is to locate her. Once you have found her, you will deliver a message from me. You will tell her that she is no longer bound by that man's threats, and that she will be protected for the rest of her life." He concluded the conversation with a decisive click and turned his full attention to Irene, his blue eyes burning with a fierce, protective fire. "Levi Donnelly is not merely a man who was cruel to his wife, Irene. He is something far more sinister. He is a predator, a serial offender who has spent years perfecting the art of hiding his monstrous acts behind a wall of money and legal threats. He has executed this exact strategy before, repeating the pattern countless times. He purchased the silence of those he hurt. He intimidated potential witnesses until they were too terrified to come forward. What you endured was not just the end of a bad marriage. You are the survivor of a man who methodically finds and victimizes women he perceives as vulnerable. For anyone hearing this story right now, for anyone who has ever felt the crushing weight of self-blame, please listen. If you have ever wondered why you stayed, why you did not get out sooner, or why you believed you were not strong enough, then you need to hear the truth that Irene was just given. She was never the one who was weak. She was handpicked by a master manipulator, a man who had practiced and refined his cruelties on numerous other victims long before he ever met her. The shame she had carried for so long was never hers to own. The stark, undeniable reality of Ben's words slammed into Irene with the force of a tidal wave, shattering years of carefully constructed guilt. She had tortured herself with those same questions a million times. Why did I let this happen to me? Why was I not brave enough to just walk away? Now, standing in the quiet of the room, the true answer emerged with blinding clarity. Levi did not just get angry, he had a calculated system. His methods of cruelty and control were a well-rehearsed performance, polished through years of practice. She had never been weak. She had been systematically dismantled and caged by a monster with a terrifying amount of experience. The suffocating blanket of shame that had pressed down on her for so many years finally began to dissolve from her shoulders. In the space it left behind, a cold, quiet, and righteous fury began to take root. "The settlement money," she breathed, her voice a whisper of dawning comprehension, as a long-forgotten piece of gossip resurfaced in her memory. That huge amount of money he paid to his first wife. I remember now. He told everyone that his parents' life savings, their entire retirement fund, had been wiped out in a catastrophic investment. Ben offered a solemn, confirming nod. "He is going to answer for every last bit of it. This is not just about the pain he inflicted on you. This is for every single woman he has ever broken. The legal system will confine him to a physical prison. My organization will ensure that his mind becomes its own inescapable cage, forcing him to live every single day for the rest of his life with the faces of the women he tried to destroy. That will be his true punishment." Over the following 72 hours, Benjamin's promise of retribution was executed with the chilling precision of a military operation. Each action was flawlessly timed for maximum destruction. The comprehensive financial audit he had ordered ripped through Levi's professional world like a hurricane, exposing a deeply rooted pattern of criminal behavior. The auditors uncovered years of methodical embezzlement from his company and a brazen history of expense account fraud. The fallout was swift and merciless. In less than 48 hours, Levi lost his position. He was not just fired, he was terminated with cause for gross misconduct, a permanent stain on his record that guaranteed he would never work in his industry again and left him without a single dollar of severance. His public disgrace was initiated by a single, untraceable message sent to key media outlets. The tip outlined a disturbing and credible history of domestic abuse tied to a prominent local insurance executive. Within days, Levi Donnelly's name and face were plastered across every local news channel and website. The story became a firestorm when his first wife agreed to a televised interview, finally liberated from the legal chains that had silenced her. A team of attorneys, funded secretly by Ben, had systematically invalidated the non-disclosure agreement she had been forced to sign. At the same time, his financial existence was methodically strangled. Every bank account he controlled was frozen as part of the official criminal investigation. His home fell into immediate foreclosure. The network of people he called friends, his professional associates, and even his own relatives began to distance themselves, creating a widening chasm of isolation until he was left completely and utterly alone. Trapped inside a stark jail cell, Levi Donnelly finally confronted the list of charges brought against him: attempted murder, assault with a deadly weapon, and felony witness intimidation. While he waited for his trial to begin, a terrible and absolute understanding washed over him. He realized, far too late, that he had chosen to provoke an enemy he could not intimidate, could not bribe, and could not escape. His entire existence had been founded on his ability to control and manipulate those around him, but that power had been stripped away. He had focused all of his rage and cruelty on the destruction of one woman. In doing so, he had inadvertently summoned a far more powerful and far more dangerous monster into his life. Irene witnessed all of this from a safe distance, watching the complete collapse of Levi's world. She followed the initial news reports from her hospital room, then from the quiet comfort of a private recovery facility Ben had provided. Eventually, she moved into a beautiful, high-security apartment that he owned. A significant part of her remained deeply intimidated by Ben. She was unnerved by the incredible reach of his influence, the shadowy world he moved through, and the cold efficiency with which he delivered his justice. But she could not ignore one simple, overwhelming fact. For the first time in more than a decade, she could finally take a full, deep breath. For the first time since the day she married Levi Donnelly, she could close her eyes at night without the sickening fear that this would be the night he finally succeeded in killing her. The relentless, suffocating dread that had been the constant background hum of her life had vanished completely. It was simply gone. Something else had settled into its place, a deep and profound awareness of the dangerous man who had made her survival his personal mission. But she was beginning to understand that his capacity for violence was not a threat to her. It was a shield. It was a formidable weapon pointed outward, ready to defend her against anyone who might ever try to cause her harm again. And within the fortress of his protection, Irene began to rediscover a sensation she had thought was lost to her forever. She found a genuine and profound sense of peace. 3 weeks after she had left the hospital, Ben arrived at her new apartment. When she cautiously opened the door, he was standing in the hallway, and for the first time since she had met him, he appeared hesitant, almost unsure of himself. His typical air of absolute command had been replaced by a quiet vulnerability. "There is something that I need to tell you," he began, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "It is something I should have been completely honest with you about from the very moment this all started." Irene's body went rigid, her muscles tightening as she braced herself for another life-altering revelation. "I did not intervene to save you with any expectation of being repaid," Ben continued, his piercing blue eyes holding her gaze. "I made the choice to help you because, after so many years of living in a world of shadows, you were the only source of genuine light I had ever encountered. I watched you from afar, saw you fighting with everything you had just to hold on, to protect that small coffee shop of yours, while you were carrying such an unimaginable weight of private suffering. To witness your strength, day after day, it changed something fundamental within me." He took a single, deliberate step closer, narrowing the space between them. "I am fully aware that my world is a terrifying place to you. I have no illusions about who I am or the life I have led, but it is critically important to me that you understand this. Whatever you decide to do now, whatever future you choose, you will always have my protection. Whether you choose to build a new life here, or you decide to leave and start over somewhere far away from me, you will be safe. That is my unconditional promise to you. There are no conditions. There are no hidden costs. Your safety is not a debt you have to settle. It is, and it has always been, simply what you deserve." Irene stared at the man before her, a walking paradox who had brought both terror and salvation into her home. He was a creature of vengeance, an absolute monster to his enemies, yet he had become her most dedicated protector. She felt something fundamental shift inside of her, a change so deep she knew she would never be the same. With a voice steadied by newfound honesty, she spoke. "I have no idea what the next chapter of my life is supposed to be." She let out a small, weary breath. "I cannot even begin to imagine if a person like me could find a place in your world, or if that is something I would ever truly want." He nodded, his expression soft and understanding. "That is a completely fair thing to say." She held his gaze, her eyes now completely clear of the fear that had once defined her. "But there is one thing I know with absolute certainty," she pressed on. "For the very first time in my life, someone stood up for me. Someone truly saw the hell I was living in and refused to look away. Someone guaranteed that the man who tormented me can never harm me, or any other woman, ever again. Benjamin Parrish, whatever else you are the person who did that for me. You did not just save my life, you gave it back to me. That is a gift I will carry in my heart for the rest of my days." What she offered him in that moment was not a simple confession of romantic love. It was not a hollow promise of forgiveness that wiped away the darkness of his past actions. What passed between them was something infinitely more profound and genuine. It was a shared recognition of a brutal truth about the world. Sometimes, the only thing that can shield an innocent soul from utter annihilation is a different kind of darkness. It is a darkness that, when the moment of truth arrives, makes a conscious choice to protect rather than destroy. Thank you for staying with us through Irene's entire journey to its powerful conclusion. Her struggle and eventual triumph carry a message that I hope you will never forget. No person, under any circumstances, should be forced to live their life imprisoned by fear. The very systems we are raised to believe in will not always be capable of protecting you. Those restraining orders, those legal documents, those official reassurances from authority, they often prove to be nothing more than fragile pieces of paper when you are confronted by a predator who is convinced that you belong to them. But that harsh reality absolutely does not mean you are left without allies or without hope. In fact, safety and support often emerge from the people and places you would least expect. Very often, the single most powerful action you can ever take is that initial decision to no longer endure your suffering in complete silence. Sometimes, true courage is about discovering that tiny spark within you to sign your name on a legal form. It might be the strength to make one terrifying phone call that could change everything, or it could be the simple, defiant act of forcing yourself to believe that you are worthy of safety, even when it feels like the whole world is telling you that you are not. Irene not only survived, but reclaimed her freedom because she took that one monumental first step. Every single good thing that followed was a direct result of that one courageous act of rebellion. If this story resonated with you, if it was a powerful reminder of the strength you hold inside, or if it brought to mind someone you know who desperately needs to hear this, please take a second to support our work by hitting the like button and sharing this video. Your subscription is what makes this channel possible. It is the fuel that allows me to keep creating more stories just like this one. Stories about amazing women who refuse to let the world break them. I would love for you to go down to the comment section right now and tell me something specific. Which single moment in Irene's difficult journey made the biggest emotional connection with you? I promise you that I personally read every comment that you post, and I would be truly honored to hear what you have to say. After you have left your thoughts, please be sure to click on the video that is now appearing on your screen. The next story is already prepared for you, and I can assure you it is an unforgettable tale that you are absolutely not going to want to miss. All of the content you find on this channel is created through a long process of detailed research, careful writing, and hands-on editing by our whole team. Our entire purpose is to share stories that have real, meaningful lessons and powerful emotional truth. Each and every narrative that we present is crafted with a single mission in mind: to inspire you, to empower you, and to serve as a constant reminder that no matter how desperate your circumstances may feel, you are never really fighting your fight all by yourself. The core lesson from Irene's experience is undeniable and clear. You were never weak for staying in that situation. You were never the one who was the problem. Manipulators like Levi dedicate years of their lives to sharpening their tools of psychological control and intimidation. Your only responsibility right now is to focus on taking that one initial step forward. That could be making a single phone call, adding your signature to one document, or having one single moment where you allow yourself to believe that you deserve to feel safe. That one act of pure courage has the power to change the entire course of your life. If this narrative gave you a sense of hope, or if it reminded you of your own incredible resilience, please take a moment to press the like button. Consider sharing this video with another person who might need to hear this message today. And if you are new here, please subscribe to the channel. Your support is what gives me the ability to continue telling the stories of women who would not be defeated and refused to be broken. Irene was trapped by a terrible injustice, a powerless woman fighting a system designed to crush her. Her story proves that true power is the strength to protect others. Let your voice be a part of that power. Please, leave a comment below and tell me something specific. Which moment in her journey made you feel her pain the most? I read every single word you write, and I would be honored to hear your thoughts. Your empathy is what gives her story meaning. Do not stop now. The next story is ready for you. Click on the video that is appearing on your screen. Trust me when I say, you absolutely do not want to miss what happens next. We know that life can feel deeply unfair, leaving good people feeling exhausted and completely isolated. Our channel exists to fight that darkness. We believe that stories are a form of protection. Every piece of content here is built with purpose by our team. Each narrative is the result of careful research, thoughtful writing, and detailed editing. We do this to bring you meaningful stories that offer real emotional value and unforgettable life lessons. We craft every video to inspire you, to empower you, and to serve as a constant reminder that no matter how dark your own situation may seem, you are never truly alone. This content was carefully researched, written, and hand-edited by our team to deliver real meaning and lasting lessons. Every story on this channel is crafted with one purpose: to inspire you, empower you, and remind you that no matter how dark your situation feels, you are never truly alone.